You talk a lot about data literacy, and I think this speaks to data literacy. And I think, I remember taking statistics classes, and I realized while I was taking them that, I don't have to be a master statistician. That's not the reason I'm taking this as part of my doctorate program. I'm taking this so I'm better attuned at reading the data, because it is like a reading skill. You're not reading text, you're reading data, whether it is qualitative or quantitative. And I agree, you kind of have to marry the both of them together to create true meaning out of it. But yeah, what is data literacy to you, and why is it important in our culture for people to start developing that capacity to really be able to read the data?
I think we are so surrounded by data, by choices that are influenced by data, by algorithms that are run by data, that at this point, there's no such thing as data people and non-data people. We're all either comfortable, intentional data people or accidental, uncomfortable data people, right? We don't have a choice about that. The same way that if you ask somebody like, do you need to be literate? Nobody's going to say, no, it's fine. I don't need to read. Like, we all need to read. We need to be able to read words in order to navigate this world. And so data literacy is that ability to be conversant at some level with data or the products of data. And I always, again, when people are like, well, I'm not a numbers person, it's like, again, no one says they're not a words person. People might say, right, hey, I had dyslexia and it took me twice as long to learn to read, but I still learned to read because we all have to. And so the same way, like, some things might come a little bit faster to somebody else, but we all have a certain base level of comfort with the products of data that we need. Now, we don't all have to write academic papers. We don't all have to be able to write medical textbooks. We don't all have to speak 17 languages, right? Like, I'm not going to read Dostoevsky in its native Russian, right? Not happening.
Why not?
But I can read right?
You're denying yourself a true pleasure.
but like, I might read a translated version, and if I didn't understand that, I might pick up the Cliff Notes so that I know what on earth is going on in War and Peace, right? Like, there are many different levels at which we can engage with data, and we might need to find the appropriate one for us based on our work, on the decisions we have to make in our life, right? And sometimes we might have to step it up. If you get a complex medical diagnosis, you may have to invest some time in increasing your data literacy around the numbers that we use in medicine, right? Yeah. What does it mean if a test comes back that has a 98% chance, 98% specificity and a 90% sensitivity, and you get a positive result on that test, right? Like, what does that actually mean? And there's a level of data literacy, of comfort in interpreting those numbers that you're just going to have to develop. So that's, for me, what data literacy is some level of ability to accurately use the products of data.
One of the things that I see common that drive me insane out there when it comes to data literacy, and its usage is intentional to spur on people's fear, is when I'll hear a phrase like in the news, like, there was a 25% increase to said such. And the first question you ask, what was the percentage in the first place? Yeah. And that's not it. They just, and they intentionally hide that reality. They say, there was a 2,000% increase into, well, maybe the percentage was 0.00001% in the first place, and they do it all the time. And I know they do it intentionally. It drives me insane.
Well, I mean, so I spent a lot of time talking about infectious diseases and studying it for my PhD. And I realized that the vast majority of the population has not done that when COVID happened. Right. And so all of a sudden, when people are talking about risks of infection and risks of serious disease, and I just realized how little exposure most of us truly have to informed discussions about risk. Like, what actually do these different numbers around risk mean? And how do we connect those numbers to the things that we want out of our lives? Right? How do we have truly intentional discussions and thoughts and decisions, right, around the things we want in our life? Sorry.
No, my dog wanted to make a comment, but I just said that I'll speak for her, though. And I know what she wanted to say. And that was this, that I have this conversation so often with people. And a good example, the example I always use, which is crazy. But for me, jumping out of an airplane is way more too risky for me to do. But again, statistically, it's probably not that big of a risk. And on top of that, those who enjoy it, they're willing to take whatever risk that is. So like you said, the value of risk is totally based upon your value system and how you think about and qualify your life and the things around you. And I try to have that conversation with people quite often. And people do have that tendency to think that there is a objective value to risk.
Exactly. And there is not. And this is where, like, I will never say, oh, well, you have to follow the numbers, follow the science. No, you don't. You make decisions about the things that matter to you. And those decisions can be quite complex because we don't make decisions in isolation, right? Your decision about how much risk of exposure to COVID and chance of catching that is not made in isolation of the impacts of how you avoid getting exposed to COVID, right? I mean, if you are at severe risk of suicide, locking yourself in your house may be that cost may not be worth the reduction that you get in your risk of COVID exposure. Yeah. And so we're not very good at being able to hold all the pieces that are involved in thinking about that just from a social sense, right? Like just for me, thinking about all the things in my life that matter to me. And we're even worse at then considering the associated risks or costs or like data around than assessing all those things that are important to us.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about the whole COVID phenomenon in relation to data too, it's like you have and purpose in people and meaning in people's lives. You have, of course, this polarization that happened around COVID with these two extreme sides, and in a sense, both sides were overemphasizing this what they perceived as the science, right, to justify the narrative of how we should behave. You know, when the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, as it always is.
Well, and I don't know that I would say overemphasizing the science. They were picking different numbers and then trying to use their numbers, like the thing that mattered to them the most, and trying to like beat the other side into saying like, why don't you agree with me? Because my number is clearly look at my number. That's the objectively most important number. And then the other side would be like, look at my number. It's the most objectively important number. And I think I see this happen a lot where we're actually having an argument about values. But we're trying to use data to disprove the other person's values. And you'll get absolutely nowhere with that.
And that's almost a definition of confirmation bias, right?
Not quite. So, I mean, with confirmation, and because for me, confirmation bias is where you seek out data that reaffirms a decision you've already made, right? In this case, you're trying to change somebody else's mind, but you're using the wrong language, right? You're using the wrong approach because if we grossly oversimplify the argument around COVID lockdowns, one side was looking at like social values of freedom and self-determination. And the other side was looking at reduction in deaths from COVID. Right? Like, what are our primary goals? Reduction in deaths from COVID, right? How do we keep those as small as possible? And how do we preserve self-determination and freedom? And so each side would sort of use numbers that would talk about why their approach, right? Either lockdowns or not lockdowns, mask mandates, no mask mandates. And they would say, well, here are numbers that support why my choice will achieve the things that matter to me, right? And so then they would say, oh, so like the side who was supporting lockdowns and mask mandates would say, well, we can save, millions of lives if we do this. And the other side was saying, but I will lose these enumerated freedoms. People will die from suicide in these ways because of lack of self-determination. And they would just yell those numbers at each other. Rather than saying, well, hang on, I think the issue is that we're valuing different things as our top priority. And no amount of numbers is going to make you change your top priority. But if I say, hey, you know what? And this is actually the example that I like talking about is actually more vaccines, like not COVID vaccines, kids vaccines, right? As a parent, I have to make a decision of whether to vaccinate my children. And when I watch people who believe you should vaccinate your kids against kids, parents who think they shouldn't, again, they tend to yell data at each other rather than look at the value, right? And what I found when I talk, I am a big proponent of vaccinating your children against common childhood diseases. And I was talking to a parent who was very concerned about this. And rather than immediately starting to pound them into submission with numbers that were my numbers, because this parent was quoting, numbers of times that she had heard that children had ended up being harmed by these childhood vaccinations, I said, you know what? I hear how concerned you are about keeping your kids safe. And you're worried about making the right choice that's going to give them the best chance to stay safe. And she's like, yeah, You're right. Like, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. And I was like, then we both can have the same goal here.
That's right.
Now we have met on the same values. And so we can now have a discussion where our numbers are going to line up. Because now when I tell her, what's the risk of your kid getting measles and the damage that can come from measles versus what's the risk that they experience a serious side effect from vaccinations, right? And we can have a real discussion about that because there are risks to getting your vaccination. There is no safe option here. And when we both recognize that we have the same goal, which is keeping our kids safe, and we're both willing to recognize the risks of both sides, now we can have this like very open and much more fruitful discussion than me just yelling at her saying, you must hate your kids. And she being like, I can't believe that you're just like falling victim to the corrupt, mega, what is it called? The medical industrial complex, right? And you're just blindly doing what they say. Yeah, the pharmaceutical industrial complex. And then we would have gotten nowhere, right? Because we would have just yelled at each other.